Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The scream that tore through the midnight air at Stone Ridge Ranch was not from a coyote or a panther. It was the sound of a world being ripped apart. It was Elara's. Jedediah Stone burst from his room, rifle in hand, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a rhythm he hadn't felt since the day he'd buried his wife. He met Elara in the narrow hallway, her face a pale, ghostly mask in the moonlight slanting through the window. Her eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond the chaos outside, beyond the sinister orange glow that was beginning to lick the sky from the direction of the hay barn. Shouts from his men, the panicked lowing of cattle, the crackle of hungry flames, all of it faded to a dull roar in his ears when she spoke, her voice a shattered whisper. "He's gone. Jedediah. Leo is gone." Jed's blood ran cold. He pushed past her, his boots thundering on the floorboards, and skidded to a halt in the doorway of her small room. The window was open, the curtain flapping like a phantom limb in the sudden, hot breeze. And the cradle, the small wooden cradle he had silently, painstakingly repaired just a week ago, was empty. A raw, guttural roar of fury escaped his lips as he saw the single, muddy boot print on the floor, a print left by a man with no business being there. He knew who was behind this. There was only one shadow long and venomous enough to stretch this far. Turning back to the yard, now illuminated by the growing fire, he bellowed a name into the chaotic night, a name that was a curse, a promise of death. Silas. What brought this night of fire and terror to the doorstep of a grieving rancher and a woman running from her past? How did a simple arrangement for a cook descend into a life-or-death struggle? Stay with us as the story of Stone Ridge unfolds. And if you believe in the kind of love forged in fire, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of frontier hearts. Part 1. An Unspoken Bargain. The silence at Stone Ridge Ranch was a heavy, suffocating thing. It clung to the weathered boards of the main house, settled in the dust of the barren corral, and lived deep within the heart of its owner, Jedediah "Jed" Stone. 2 years had passed since he'd laid his wife, Isabel, to rest on the hill overlooking the creek, and in those 2 years, the ranch had begun to die alongside him. The drought had leached the life from the pastures, turning them a brittle, ghostly yellow. The cattle grew thin, and the lines on Jed's face grew deeper. He was a man carved from the very rock of the ridge his ranch was named for, hard, unyielding, and slowly being worn down by the relentless elements. His orders to his men were clipped, his evenings were spent in the solitary company of a whiskey bottle, and the sprawling house felt less like a home and more like a tomb, a monument to a life that was over. The final straw came not as a crash of thunder, but as the clatter of a tin plate hitting the floor of the mess hall, followed by a chorus of curses. The latest in a long line of itinerant cooks had gotten drunk and mistaken salt for sugar in the cornbread. Jed had fired the man on the spot, and now faced a near mutiny from a crew of 15 hungry, overworked cowboys. It was this, a simple matter of food, that forced his hand. With a heavy sigh, he penned a notice. A cook was needed. Capable. Reliable. He didn't care who, as long as they could turn flour and beans into something that wouldn't start a riot. A week later, she appeared. She didn't ride in on a fine horse or a sturdy wagon, but seemed to materialize out of the heat haze at the end of the long dirt track leading to the ranch. Jed saw her from the barn, a small, slight figure against the vast, indifferent sky. As she drew closer, he saw the exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin, the the travel stain on her faded calico dress, and the fierce, protective way she clutched a swaddled infant to her chest. Her bonnet did little to shield her face from the punishing sun, and her eyes, when she finally stood before him, were the color of new spring grass, holding a mixture of desperation and a pride that had refused to be broken. "Saw your notice in town," she said, her voice quiet but clear, wasting no words. "My name is Elara. I can cook." Jed stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the advertisement he'd written with the woman standing before him. He'd expected a grizzled old man, perhaps a stout, no-nonsense widow. Not this. Not a young woman with a babe in arms, looking as if a strong gust of wind might carry her away. Before he could form a refusal, an old, stooped figure emerged from the house, wiping his hands on a stained apron. It was Elias Vance, the ranch foreman, a man whose loyalty to the Stone family was absolute, and whose devotion to the memory of Isabel was fierce. He'd been with the family since before Jed was born, and had viewed Isabel as the daughter he'd never had. His eyes, pale and watery, swept over Elara with open disdain. "What's this, Jedediah?" he rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "A stray. We ain't a charity." Jed's jaw tightened. "She's here about the cook position, Elias." Elias let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "A cook? With that?" He gestured to the baby. "The kitchen's no place for a squalling infant. Isabel would never have allowed it. She kept a proper, orderly house." The name hung in the air between them, a ghost summoned to pass judgment. Elara flinched almost imperceptibly at the mention of another woman's name, but her gaze remained fixed on Jed. "He's a quiet baby," she said, her voice steady. "And my cooking is good. I don't ask for wages, just room and board. For now." The offer was one of pure desperation, and it pricked at something deep inside Jed, a part of him he thought had long since turned to stone. He needed a cook. She needed a home. It was a simple, unspoken bargain, stripped of all pleasantries. "The kitchen's a mess," he said, his voice rough. "The work is hard. The men are harder." "I'm not afraid of hard," Elara replied, her chin held high. Jed gave a sharp, decisive nod, ignoring the venomous glare from Elias. "Fine. You cook tonight. If the men don't mutiny, you can stay in the old storage room off the kitchen. But the moment that child becomes a problem, you're both gone." It was a harsh welcome, a contract built on a razor's edge, but as Elara stepped over the threshold, clutching her son Leo, it was the first safe place she had known in a very, very long time. The storage room was little more than a closet, smelling of dust, dried mice, and forgotten years. A sliver of a window, caked with grime, let in a pathetic slice of afternoon light, illuminating a space barely large enough for a narrow cot and a few crates. There was no kindness in the offering, only function. But for Elara, it was a fortress. She gently laid Leo down in a wooden crate she'd lined with her own shawl, his small face serene in sleep, oblivious to the precariousness of their new life. She took a moment, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, the only anchor in her turbulent world. Then she straightened up, tied her hair back with a worn piece of ribbon, and faced her new domain. The kitchen. It was a disaster. Grease coated the walls, the stone hearth was choked with old ash, and the shelves were a chaotic jumble of dented tins and half-empty sacks of weevil-infested flour. It was a room that reflected the soul of the ranch, neglected, functional, and devoid of any warmth. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm her. But then she remembered the alternative: the road, the endless uncertainty, the face of the man she was running from. That memory was a fire in her belly, and with a deep breath, she began to work. She moved with a quiet, relentless efficiency that belied her small frame, scrubbing, sorting, and cleaning with a ferocity born of necessity. She found a small stash of potatoes in a cellar, a side of salt pork hanging in the smokehouse, and a sack of flour that was salvageable. From these meager beginnings, she would build her defense. By sundown, the mess hall, which was just a long, rough-hewn table in the room adjacent to the kitchen, began to fill with the weary, sweat-stained ranch hands. They stomped in, their faces grim, expecting another inedible concoction. The air, however, was different. Instead of the usual smell of burnt beans, a rich, savory aroma of roasted pork, onions, and fresh-baked cornbread filled the room. The men stopped, sniffing the air like suspicious wolves. They watched as Elara, her face flushed from the heat of the fire, moved back and forth, placing platters of food on the table. She didn't speak, just worked, her movements fluid and purposeful. The meal was simple, but it was honest. The pork was tender, the beans were thick and smoky, and the cornbread was golden and moist. For the first time in months, the only sound in the mess hall was the scrape of forks against plates, not muttered complaints. Jed stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. He saw the surprise on his men's faces, the way they cleaned their plates and even went back for more. He saw Elias Vance seated at the far end of the table, eating with a grim reluctance, unable to find fault in the food, but clearly furious at being unable to. Jed's gaze then shifted to Elara. She was ladling stew into a small bowl for herself, her shoulders slumped with an exhaustion she had kept hidden all day. As she sat on a small stool in the corner of the kitchen, she rocked Leo's crate gently with her foot while she ate. A deep, aching loneliness echoed in Jed's chest. He hadn't realized how loud the silence in his own house had become until this woman and her child had filled it with the simple, domestic sounds of life. Later that night, long after the men had retired to the bunkhouse, Jed found himself standing outside the main house, staring at Isabel's darkened window. He pulled a small, silver locket from under his shirt. Inside was a tiny, painted portrait of her smiling face. He remembered the music she used to bring to this house, the laughter. Now, there was nothing. But as he stood there, a new sound drifted out from the kitchen, a soft, gentle humming. It was Elara, singing a lullaby to her son. It wasn't Isabel's music, but it was music nonetheless. A quiet, resilient melody in the heart of the crushing silence. He closed the locket, the cool metal a familiar weight against his skin, and for the first time, the memory of his wife felt less like a comfort and more like a cage. Part 2. Whispers of a Buried Past. Weeks bled into a month, and the rhythm of Stone Ridge Ranch slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to change. The mornings were no longer greeted with curses from the mess hall, but with the scent of strong coffee and frying bacon. The men, who had initially treated Elara with a mixture of suspicion and pity, began to soften. They started calling her ma'am, tipping their hats as she passed, and one of them, a lanky cowboy named Dusty, even left a small bouquet of wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill one morning. These were small gestures, but on a ranch starved of gentleness, they were monumental. Elara, for her part, remained reserved but kind. She learned the men's names, knew who liked their coffee black, and who preferred an extra piece of pie. She created a small world of warmth and order within the chaos of the ranch, a sanctuary centered around the hearth. Her most significant act of claiming a space, however, happened outside. Behind the kitchen, there was a small, sun-beaten patch of earth that everyone had ignored for years, a place where only the toughest weeds survived. Elara saw potential where others saw wasteland. She spent what little free time she had clearing the patch, turning the soil, and carefully planting a collection of seeds and cuttings she had painstakingly carried with her in a small cloth pouch. It was this garden that reignited Elias Vance's dormant hostility. He watched her from a distance, his face a thundercloud of suspicion. To him, this was not the act of a simple cook. It was strange, unnatural. One afternoon, he confronted her as she was tending to a row of small, green shoots. "What devilry is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Growing weeds." Elara looked up, her hands covered in soil. She didn't flinch from his glare. "They aren't weeds, Mr. Vance. This is mint, for tea. And that is yarrow, for cuts and fevers." Elias scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Fevers? We have a doctor for fevers. Isabel always said that home remedies were for gypsies and heathens. A God-fearing woman puts her trust in medicine, not dirt." The comparison was a deliberate cruelty, another attempt to put Elara in her place, to remind her she was an outsider, a pale imitation of the woman he revered. Elara rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sometimes, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice low but firm, "the doctor is 2 hours away on a fast horse. And sometimes, God puts the medicine right here in the dirt for us to find. You just have to know where to look." The confrontation was interrupted by the crunch of boots on gravel. Jed had been mending a fence nearby and had overheard the entire exchange. He walked over, his expression unreadable, and stopped between them. He didn't look at Elara, but fixed his gaze on his old foreman. "Elias," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The woman is tending her garden. Let her be. Her work in the kitchen is good. That's all that matters." Elias's face flushed with indignation. He opened his mouth to protest, to remind Jed of his duty to Isabel's memory, but the cold, hard look in Jed's eyes silenced him. He gave Elara one last withering glare before turning on his heel and stomping away. Jed stood there for a moment after Elias had gone. He looked from the neat rows of herbs to Elara's determined face. He didn't understand what she was doing, not really. But he understood resilience. He understood the act of coaxing life from barren ground. It was what he was trying, and failing, to do with the ranch every single day. He gave a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement that was more than any praise he had offered her before, and walked away. The whispers had started. The men now talked of her garden, of the strange-smelling leaves she dried by the window. Some were intrigued. Others, influenced by Elias, muttered that it wasn't right. Elara was no longer just the cook. She was becoming a mystery, a woman whose past was as unknown as the properties of the strange plants she nurtured. The simmering tension between old ways and new, between suspicion and gratitude, came to a head on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. A young cowboy, Billy, barely 18 and still green, was out helping mend a line of fence in the rocky northern pasture. Reaching into a thicket of brush to retrieve a dropped tool, he never saw the rattlesnake coiled in the shade. His scream of pain and terror cut through the still air, and his partner rode like a man possessed back to the ranch, shouting the news before his horse had even skidded to a halt. Panic erupted. A snakebite on the frontier was often a death sentence. The nearest doctor was in Yellowhorn, a hard 2-hour ride away, and by the time he arrived, it would likely be too late. They carried Billy into the main house and laid him on a cot. His leg was already swelling, angry and purple, and his face was pale with a sheen of cold sweat. Elias Vance, for all his bluster, was useless. He wrung his hands, muttering about sending for the preacher and pouring whiskey down the boy's throat, a remedy that would only speed the venom's journey to his heart. Jed was already grabbing his saddlebags, his face a grim mask of determination. He would make the ride, even if it was hopeless. It was his man, his responsibility. It was then that Elara stepped forward. She had been in the kitchen, but the commotion had drawn her out, with Leo balanced on one hip. She handed the baby to a stunned Dusty, strode over to the cot, and knelt beside Billy. The room fell silent. All eyes were on her. Her movements were calm, precise, and authoritative. "Keep him still," she commanded, her voice cutting through the panic. "And someone fetch me my pouch from the garden, the one with the dark leaves. Bring boiling water and clean rags." No one questioned her. They moved to obey, startled into action by her sheer confidence. While they scrambled, she took a small, sharp knife from her belt, sterilized it in the flame of a lantern, and made 2 small, shallow cuts over the bite marks. There were gasps, but she ignored them, leaning down to draw out some of the venom. When the pouch arrived, she worked quickly, crushing a handful of broad, dark leaves, plantain, she knew it as, with a rock, mixing it with clay and water to form a thick poultice. She smeared the mixture over the wound, the heat from the poultice already working to draw out the poison. "This will slow it," she said, looking directly at Jed for the first time. "But the fever will come. We have to fight the fever." For the next several hours, Elara was a general commanding a war in that small room. She sent men for willow bark to brew a tea to fight the inflammation, for cool water from the well to bathe Billy's forehead. She never left his side. Jed stood by the door, having abandoned his desperate ride to town. He watched her, mesmerized. He saw the way she murmured comforting words to Billy when he cried out in delirium, the steady, gentle touch of her hands, the fierce concentration in her eyes. This was not the timid, desperate woman who had arrived at his gate a month ago. This was a force of nature. Elias watched too, his face a mixture of horror and disbelief, his deeply ingrained prejudices warring with the undeniable reality before him. As night fell and the long, tense vigil continued, the entire ranch held its breath. The only sounds were Billy's ragged breathing and Elara's soft, humming voice. Just before dawn, when the shadows were at their deepest, Billy's breathing, which had been shallow and fast, began to deepen and slow. The fire of the fever seemed to recede. He stirred, and his eyes fluttered open. He was weak, but he was alive. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Elara, her face pale with exhaustion, finally sagged against the wall. Jed crossed the room in 2 long strides and stood before her. The gap between them felt charged, different. All the unspoken words, the judgments, the assumptions, they had all been burned away in the crucible of the long night. "You saved him," Jed said, his voice hoarse with emotion he didn't know how to express. Elara simply nodded, too tired to speak. In the quiet dawn, with a young man's life hanging as a testament between them, Jed Stone looked at Elara and saw not just a cook, not just a mother, but a healer. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that nothing on Stone Ridge Ranch would ever be the same. Part 3. A sickness in the land, a healing in the heart. The morning after Billy's recovery, a new atmosphere settled over Stone Ridge. The whispers about Elara had not just died down, they had transformed. The story of the snakebite, embellished with each telling, had turned into a legend. She was no longer just the cook, she was Miss Elara, a figure of respect. The men looked at her with a kind of awe, and even Elias Vance was forced into a grudging, resentful silence. He could not argue with a life saved. The change was most profound in Jed. The professional distance he had maintained was now impossible. He found himself watching her, not with suspicion, but with a burgeoning fascination. He noticed the small things. The way she smiled when Leo babbled, the gentle efficiency of her hands as she kneaded dough, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. One afternoon, he saw her stumble on the broken top step leading into the kitchen, catching herself just before she fell while holding Leo. He said nothing, but the next morning, before the sun had risen, Elara awoke to the sound of a hammer. She stepped outside to find Jed, sleeves rolled up, methodically replacing the rotten board with a new, sturdy plank of pine. He didn't look at her or acknowledge her presence, but the action was louder than any words. It was an apology for his initial harshness, a thank you for saving his man, a silent admission that she belonged here. But as this fragile new trust began to take root, a far greater threat loomed. The drought, which had been a constant, oppressive weight, tightened its grip. The creek slowed to a trickle, and the grass in the pastures became a dry, rustling carpet of brown. Then, the sickness began. It started with a single steer, found lying by a dried-up waterhole, its breath coming in ragged gasps. Jed dismissed it as a one-off, a weak animal succumbing to the heat. But the next day, there were 3 more. Within a week, a dozen were sick, and more were stumbling, their eyes dull, refusing to eat. A sickness in the herd was a rancher's worst nightmare, and for Jed, whose finances were already stretched to the breaking point with a looming bank payment, it was a death knell. Desperation clawed at him. He rode himself and his men ragged, trying to separate the sick from the healthy, trying every remedy he knew. Nothing worked. The sickness spread like a curse through the herd, a silent, deadly plague that threatened to wipe out the last vestige of his family's legacy. He became a ghost of himself, his face gaunt, his temper frayed, the hope draining from him with every animal he was forced to shoot and bury. He was losing, and he knew it. The land he loved was betraying him, and all the strength and stubbornness that had defined him were proving useless against this invisible enemy. One evening, as Jed stood staring at the grim row of fresh graves on the hill, Elara approached him quietly. She had been watching the sickness with a growing unease, her healer's instincts telling her this was no ordinary disease. "It's not in their blood," she said softly, her voice pulling him from his dark reverie. "It's in the grass, or what's left of it." Jed turned to her, his eyes hollow. "What are you talking about? It's the same pasture they've grazed for 50 years. The good grass is gone," she explained, her gaze sweeping over the dead fields. "They're desperate. They're eating what they would normally avoid. I think they're being poisoned, Jedediah. Slowly." He wanted to dismiss her, to cling to his own knowledge as a cattleman, but he was out of options. The way he was doing things was leading to ruin. He looked at her face, earnest and certain in the fading light, and saw the same confidence he had seen the night she'd saved Billy. He was a drowning man, and she was offering him a hand. With a weary, defeated sigh, he finally let go of his pride. "What do you need?" he asked. Given the chance, Elara moved with the urgency of a field medic in a battle. She asked Jed to rope one of the sickest cows, and with a gentleness that seemed to calm the distressed animal, she examined its mouth, its eyes, and the contents of its stomach. Her suspicions were confirmed. She found the partially digested leaves of a plant she recognized with a dreadful certainty, the deceptively named milkleaf spurge. In times of plenty, cattle avoided it, but in the desperation of the drought, they were consuming it in lethal quantities. "It's a slow poison," she explained to Jed, holding up one of the wilted leaves. "It burns them from the inside out. We can't flush it out. We have to neutralize it." Her solution was not a simple one. It was an old remedy her grandmother had taught her, a complex poultice made from crushed mesquite charcoal to absorb the toxin, boiled willow bark to fight the inflammation, and a specific type of clay from the riverbed to soothe their ravaged stomachs. It was an immense undertaking, one that would require the labor of every able-bodied man on the ranch. For the first time, Jed was not the one giving the orders. He assembled his crew, his face grim, and told them, "You'll do everything Miss Elara says." Exactly as she says it. The fate of this ranch is in her hands. That statement sent a shockwave through the men, but seeing Jed's absolute conviction, they complied. Even Elias Vance, his face a mask of conflicted duty, found himself hauling buckets of river clay, his loyalty to the ranch overriding his prejudice against its savior. What followed were 2 days and nights of relentless, grueling work that blurred into a single, exhausting effort. The air at the ranch thickened with the acrid smoke of burning mesquite and the bitter smell of boiling bark. Under Elara's calm direction, they became an army fighting a war against an invisible enemy. They ground charcoal into a fine powder, stripped bark from trees, and mixed clay into a thick, dark slurry. The hardest part was administering the remedy. Each sick cow, weakened but still powerful, had to be restrained. Jed worked alongside Elara, his strength and her knowledge becoming a seamless partnership. He would hold the animal's head steady, his muscles straining, while she carefully forced the thick, life-saving mixture down its throat, massaging its neck to ensure it swallowed. In those long hours, pressed close together in the dirt and the dust, surrounded by the sounds of sickness and struggle, a profound intimacy grew between them. They communicated with glances, with nods, their hands brushing as they worked. They were a team, bound by a single, desperate purpose. The midpoint, the moment where hope and despair hung in a perfect, terrible balance, came on the second night. The ranch's prize bull, a magnificent animal that was the last direct descendant of the herd Jed's father had started, collapsed. Its breathing was shallow, its great body shuddering. The men stood back, their faces grim, believing it was the end. "Let him go, Elara," Jed said, his voice cracking with defeat. "It's over." But Elara refused to surrender. "No," she said, her voice fierce, her face illuminated by the flickering lantern light. "We fight for this one. We fight until the end." They worked alone on the bull through the darkest hours of the night, a desperate, 2-person vigil against death itself. They bathed him with cool water and forced tiny amounts of the remedy into his mouth. As the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, the bull let out a low groan and, with a shuddering effort that seemed to take all the strength in the world, heaved himself onto his unsteady legs. He stood there, swaying, but he was standing. It was a miracle. Jed stared, his chest tight with an emotion so powerful he couldn't name it. He looked from the recovering bull to Elara, who was slumped against the corral fence, covered in mud and sweat, her face etched with exhaustion, but her eyes shining with triumph. At that moment, he saw everything clearly. She hadn't just saved his bull. She hadn't just saved his ranch. She had saved him. She had walked into the barren, silent ruin of his life and had coaxed life from it, just as she had coaxed life from the poisoned earth. The fight was no longer just about preserving the past or a legacy. It was about building a future. With her. The sickness in the land had been met by a healing in his heart, and the world had shifted on its axis. Hoàn hảo. Tôi sẽ tiếp tục quá trình sáng tác, tuân thủ nghiêm ngặt luồng công việc trong file viết kịch bản. Text để hoàn thành kịch bản. Part 4. Shadows from a Gilded Cage. The weeks that followed the great sickness were like a long, deep breath after a near drowning. Hope, a sentiment that had been a foreign currency at Stone Ridge, began to circulate freely. The cattle, lean but alive, regained their strength. Patches of new grass, encouraged by a rare spell of gentle rain, began to dot the pastures like emerald dust. The ranch was healing, and so were its people. The bond between Jed and Elara, forged in the crucible of crisis, deepened into a quiet, comfortable intimacy. The rigid lines of employer and employee had long since dissolved. He would often find reasons to be near the kitchen, mending a piece of tack or whittling a stick, just to be in her presence. She, in turn, learned the rhythm of his moods, knowing when to offer a cup of strong coffee or when to leave a plate of food for him in silence. Elias Vance, having witnessed what he could only describe as a miracle, had completed his transformation from antagonist to devoted protector. He treated Elara with a gruff, paternal affection and doted on baby Leo, carving him a small, wooden horse that the boy clutched in his tiny fist. A fragile peace had settled over Stone Ridge, the kind of peace that feels both precious and precarious, as if it might be stolen away at any moment. And then, one sun-drenched afternoon, it was a fine, black buggy, pulled by two perfectly matched gray horses, rolled down the long ranch road. It was an apparition of wealth and civility in a land of dust and grit. The man holding the reins was dressed in a tailored suit of dark wool, a silk vest, and polished boots that had never known the touch of manure. He was handsome, with a charming smile that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. Elara was outside, hanging laundry on a line, while Leo played on a blanket at her feet. When she saw the buggy, all the color drained from her face. Her breath caught in her throat, and a raw, primal fear, an emotion Jed had never seen in her, took hold. She snatched Leo from the blanket, her movements frantic, and darted back into the kitchen, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. Jed had seen the buggy approaching from the corral and walked to the main house to meet the visitor, his curiosity piqued. As the man stepped down, extending a gloved hand, Jed's protective instincts flared. "Silas Croft," the man said, his voice as smooth as oiled leather. "I'm looking for a woman, a runaway. I was told she might have found her way here." At that moment, Silas's gaze flickered past Jed, toward the kitchen window where Elara had momentarily appeared before recoiling. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. "Ah," he said softly. "There's my little songbird now." Jed's hand, which had been about to shake Croft's, dropped to his side. He turned and saw the shadow of Elara hiding just inside the doorway. He didn't understand what was happening, but he understood the terror on her face. He stepped forward, positioning himself squarely between Silas and the house. "There's no one here by that name," Jed said, his voice low and hard as granite. "You've been misinformed." Silas chuckled, a condescending sound that set Jed's teeth on edge. "Oh, I don't think so, Mr. Stone. She has many talents. My Elara. A healer, I hear. She always did have a gift for mending broken things. But she is, first and last, mine." The possessiveness in his tone was like a whip crack. He took a step forward, his charming facade beginning to crumble, revealing the ugly entitlement beneath. "I've come to take her home." Jed didn't move. He was a mountain, immovable and solid. The fragile peace of the last few weeks had been a lie, a brief respite before the arrival of this man, the source of the shadows in Elara's eyes. "The only home she has," Jed growled, "is the one she's standing in right now. And she works for me." Silas Croft's smile widened, but it was a predator's smile now, all sharp edges and predatory intent. He seemed to find Jed's defiance amusing. "Works for you?" he repeated, his voice dripping with condescension. "A man whose ranch is hanging on by a thread. I do my research, Mr. Stone. I know all about your troubles. The drought. The note at the bank in Yellow Horn. It would be a tragedy to see a legacy like yours turn to dust over a simple misunderstanding." He let the threat hang in the air, as potent as venom. He was no longer just a man looking for a woman. He was a vulture circling a dying animal, and he held all the power. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I am a reasonable man. Perhaps we can help each other. You are a man of property. You understand that some things simply have value. Return what is mine, and I will make your financial troubles disappear. The banknote will be paid. I can even arrange for a line of credit. Your ranch will be safe." The offer was a devil's bargain, a poisoned chalice presented as a lifeline. For a heart-stopping moment, Jed was torn. Everything he had fought for, the land his father and grandfather had bled for, was being offered to him on a silver platter. All he had to do was sacrifice the woman and child who had, against all odds, begun to heal his broken life. From the shadows of the doorway, Elara had heard it all. Seeing the flicker of conflict in Jed's eyes, she made a decision. She would not be the cause of his ruin. Clutching Leo so tightly the boy whimpered, she stepped out into the sunlight, her face pale but her resolve firm. "I'll go," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Just leave him and this ranch alone." Silas's eyes gleamed with triumph. He had won, but he had underestimated Jedediah Stone. Jed looked from Silas's smug face to Elara's look of terrified sacrifice. He saw the future Silas was offering, an empty, solvent ranch, a silent, dead house, and he saw the future he was about to lose, a life of struggle, perhaps, but one filled with the quiet music of Elara's presence and the sound of a child's laughter. The choice was brutally, painfully clear. He turned his back on Silas and faced Elara, his gaze so intense it seemed to hold her in place. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. Then he turned to Silas, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get off my land," he snarled. "Now." Silas's smile finally vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated rage. "You will regret this, Stone," he hissed. "I always collect what is mine." He climbed back into his buggy, his movements stiff with anger, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a promise of violence in his wake. The immediate threat was gone, but the air was thick with a new, heavier dread. That night, in the dim lamplight of the main room, the full story came pouring out of Elara. She told him everything, how she was an orphan, raised by a grandmother who taught her the ways of herbs, how, after her grandmother's death, she was taken in by Silas, who saw her not as a person, but as an asset. He had forced her to use her healing knowledge to create remedies and potions for the wealthy, often unsavory, clients of his opulent saloon, keeping her a prisoner in a gilded cage. She spoke of a kind man, a pianist at the saloon, who had loved her in secret, and who was the father of her child. Silas had discovered their affair and, in a fit of jealous rage, had the man killed, claiming Leo as his own. Her escape had been a desperate flight for her son's very life. Jed listened to it all, his expression unchanging. He didn't flinch, he didn't judge. When she finished, her voice choked with tears. He simply reached out and took her hand. A moment later, Elias Vance entered the room, holding an old rifle. He looked from Elara's tear-streaked face to Jed's resolute jaw. "The men are posted," he said quietly. "He won't find us sleeping." The ranch was no longer just a home. It was a fortress. And for the first time in her life, Elara was not fighting alone. Part 5. Fire on Stone Ridge. The days that followed Silas's visit were thick with a suffocating dread. A waiting game began. The vibrant, healing atmosphere of the ranch was replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Jed turned the ranch into a stronghold. The men, loyal to the core after everything they had been through, took up arms without question. They worked the cattle with rifles slung over their shoulders and stood guard in rotating shifts through the long, dark nights. This constant state of alert took its toll. Elara was haunted, starting at every unexpected sound. The nightmares she had kept at bay for months returned with a vengeance, leaving her pale and trembling in the pre-dawn chill. Leo, sensing his mother's fear, was fretful and rarely left her arms. Jed became her anchor in this storm of anxiety. He was a constant, steady presence. One night, finding her staring out the window, unable to sleep, he didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he quietly retrieved a dusty, forgotten guitar from a corner, Isabel's guitar. He sat down and, with fingers that were hesitant at first, began to pluck out a simple, aching melody. He wasn't a skilled player, but the soft, mournful notes filled the tense silence of the house with a profound sense of solace. He played for her until her shoulders relaxed and the terror receded from her eyes, a wordless promise that he would not let the darkness consume them. Silas was too cunning for a direct, frontal assault. His attack began with whispers and shadows. The weekly supply wagon from Yellow Horn was suddenly delayed. A small line shack on the farthest edge of the property was found burned to the ground one morning, a clear and chilling message. He was constricting his grip, trying to choke the life out of the ranch, to make them suffer before the final blow. The attack, when it finally came, was under the cover of a moonless, starless night. It began not with the sound of gunfire, but with a frantic shout from one of the lookouts. "Fire! The hay barn's on fire!" A sinister, orange glow pulsed against the black sky. The hay barn, filled with the precious winter feed they had worked so hard to salvage, was engulfed in flames. It was a devastating blow, a direct strike at the ranch's fragile recovery. Jed's heart sank. Without that feed, the cattle wouldn't survive the winter. "Elias, take 5 men and try to save what you can. The rest of you, with me," Jed yelled, his voice cutting through the rising panic. He and the bulk of his men grabbed buckets and axes and raced toward the inferno, their minds consumed with the desperate, chaotic task of fighting the blaze. The roar of the fire, the crackle of burning timber, and the shouts of the men created a wall of sound and confusion, a perfect diversion. And from the shadows on the other side of the compound, Silas Croft and 2 of his most ruthless men crept silently toward the main house, their true target now left perilously undefended. Inside the house, Elara's heart pounded in time with the frantic shouts from the yard. With Leo clutched tightly to her chest, she peered through the front window, her stomach churning at the sight of the blazing barn. The fire was a terrifying spectacle, a hungry monster consuming their future. Every man, every ounce of effort, was focused on that single point of destruction. A sudden, cold dread washed over her, a feeling entirely separate from the fire. The house was too quiet. The focus of the attack felt wrong, too obvious for a man as cunning as Silas. A floorboard creaked in the hallway behind her. She spun around, her blood turning to ice. Silas Croft stood there, framed in the doorway, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. The smoke and chaos outside had been his cover. "A shame about the hay," he said, his voice a low purr. "But then, you know I always appreciate a grand spectacle. Did you truly think you could hide from me, little songbird? Did you think this broken-down man and his pile of rocks could protect you?" He took a step forward. Elara backed away, her mind racing. "Stay away from us," she breathed. He lunged. But Elara was no longer the frightened girl he had once owned. She was a mother protecting her child. As he reached for her, she spun away and grabbed the first thing she could find, a heavy iron skillet left on the stove. She swung it with all her might, catching him on the side of the head. The blow staggered him, and he cursed, touching a hand to his temple and bringing it back stained with blood. The momentary distraction was all she needed. She bolted for the back door, but his men were blocking the exit. She was trapped. Enraged, Silas lunged again, this time ignoring her and snatching Leo from her arms. The baby let out a terrified wail. "You will learn your lesson," Silas snarled, holding the crying child like a shield. "You belong to me, and so does the boy." It was at that moment that Elara screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and fury that cut through the roar of the fire. Out at the barn, Jed heard it. It was a sound that bypassed his ears and struck him straight in the heart. He knew instantly he had been played. "It's a diversion," he roared to Elias. "He's in the house." Leaving the fire to rage, Jed sprinted back, his rifle in his hand and murder in his heart. He was too late. He saw Silas and his men mounting their horses, the small, bundled form of his son in Silas's arms. Without a second's hesitation, Jed, Elias, and 2 other men leaped onto their own horses and gave chase, riding headlong into the dark, treacherous landscape. The pursuit was a desperate, moonlit nightmare, ending at the edge of a high, wind-swept bluff. Silas reined in his horse, a sheer drop just feet behind him. He held Leo up, a wicked grin on his face. "One more step, Stone, and we all go down together." He shouted over the wind. Jed pulled his horse to a halt, his rifle aimed, but he couldn't risk a shot. He was trapped in an impossible standoff. But then, a figure emerged from the scrub brush to the side. It was Elara. She had followed them on foot, her lungs burning, her feet bleeding. Silas laughed. "Come to watch the show, my dear," he taunted. Jed saw her eyes lock with his for a split second. A plan, desperate and silent, passed between them. Jed edged his horse slightly to the left, drawing Silas's attention. In that same instant, Elara reached into the small pouch she always wore at her waist. She pulled out a handful of finely ground cayenne pepper and burr seed fluff, a mixture designed to cause maximum irritation. As Silas turned his head to gloat at Jed, she threw it with all her strength, directly into his face. He screamed, a choked, agonized sound, dropping the reins and clawing at his burning eyes. He was momentarily, completely blind. That was the only opening Jed needed. He spurred his horse forward, not at Silas, but alongside him. In one fluid, desperate motion, he lunged and snatched Leo from the flailing man's grasp, wheeling his horse away to safety. Silas, blind and enraged, stumbled backward. His horse, spooked, reared up. And then, with a final, horrified cry that was swallowed by the wind, man and horse tumbled over the edge and vanished into the darkness below. A deafening silence fell over the bluff, broken only by the whistling wind and Leo's terrified sobs. Jed rode to Elara and, with trembling hands, placed her son back into her arms. Part 6. A New Dawn on the Ridge. They rode back to the ranch not in triumph, but in a state of bone-deep, weary shock. The first rays of dawn were breaking, casting a pale, gray light on the scene of devastation. The hay barn was a smoldering, blackened skeleton against the morning sky. The ground was littered with the evidence of their struggle. But the main house stood untouched, and the soul of the ranch, its people, was safe. The threat that had poisoned their lives was gone, buried in the darkness at the bottom of the bluff. The men, grim-faced and exhausted, began the slow work of tending to the wounded and taking stock of their losses. There was no celebration, only a profound, shared sense of relief. Inside the house, Elara sat in a rocking chair by the hearth, Leo finally asleep in her arms, his small face peaceful against her chest. Jed stood by the window, watching the sunrise paint the bruised sky with colors of rose and gold. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer tense or awkward, but filled with the weight of everything they had survived. They had been through the fire, literally and figuratively, and had emerged on the other side, scarred but whole. Finally, Jed turned from the window and crossed the room to kneel before her chair. He looked at her, his face etched with exhaustion, and reached out, his calloused hand gently stroking Leo's soft hair. "When I heard him scream," Jed began, his voice low and hoarse, "when I thought he had taken you." The ranch, the cattle, all of it. It meant nothing. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw in them a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. I had forgotten what it felt to have something to lose, something that wasn't just dirt and memory. You brought this place back to life, Elara. You brought me back to life. Tears welled in Elara's eyes, not of sadness, but of a deep, cathartic release. All her life, she had been running. She had been a possession, a tool, a secret. She had never been a home. "And you," she whispered, her voice breaking, "are the first person who ever looked at me and didn't see something you could take. You saw someone worth protecting." She leaned forward, and their foreheads touched. In that simple, quiet gesture, all the pain and fear of the past months melted away, leaving only a profound and unshakable truth. A moment later, Elias Vance appeared in the doorway, his arm in a makeshift sling. He held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He said nothing, simply placed them on a small table beside them. He looked at Elara, at the sleeping child in her arms, and at the man kneeling before her. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of respect, of acceptance, of blessing. In his eyes, she was no longer the outsider, the replacement. She was the matriarch of Stone Ridge, the woman who had saved them all. Months passed, and a gentle spring breathed new life into the Texas plains. The rains came, soft and steady, washing the dust from the air and coaxing a carpet of vibrant green from the fire-scorched earth. Life returned to Stone Ridge, stronger and more resilient than before. The men, bound by the shared trauma and victory, worked with a renewed sense of purpose, their laughter once again echoing across the corral. A new barn began to rise from the ashes of the old, a symbol of their collective refusal to be broken. The fear was gone, replaced by the rhythm of hard work and the promise of a peaceful future. One bright afternoon, Jed took Elara's hand and led her up the small hill that overlooked the ranch, the place where Isabel was buried under a lone, ancient oak tree. The simple wooden cross was weathered but sturdy. For years, Jed had come here to speak to a ghost, to anchor himself to his grief. Today, he came to let her go. He stood before the grave, his hand holding Elara's, and he spoke in a low, clear voice. "Isabel," he said, "this is Elara. She's the one who taught me how to live again. She saved this place. She saved me. I think you would have liked her." He wasn't asking for permission or forgiveness, but simply closing a chapter, honoring his past while embracing his future. Elara stood silently by his side, respecting the sanctity of the moment, her heart overflowing with love for this good, honorable man. When he turned back to her, his eyes were clear of the old shadows. "I ain't a man for fancy words, Elara. I can't offer you silks or jewels. All I have is this land, this life. It's hard, and it's likely to stay that way." He reached into his coat and pulled out not a ring, but a small piece of newly carved wood. Burned into it were the words, "Stone Ridge Ranch. Jedediah, Elara, and Leo. I'm asking you to make this our home," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To build a life with me. To be my wife." She laughed through her tears, a sound of pure joy that seemed to make the wildflowers around them bloom a little brighter. "It already is my home," she whispered. Their wedding took place a week later, not in a church, but under the sprawling branches of that same oak tree. There was no preacher, only Elias Vance, who spoke a few simple, heartfelt words about family and second chances. The entire ranch was in attendance, the men scrubbed clean and wearing their Sunday best. Billy, the boy whose life she had saved, played a cheerful, if slightly off-key, tune on his harmonica. And Leo, now steady on his feet, toddled between them, holding a fistful of daisies, the guest of honor at his mother's wedding. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Jed and Elara stood on the porch of the main house. It was no longer a tomb, but a home, filled with the warmth of a simmering stew and the promise of a peaceful night. Leo took a few proud, wobbly steps from his mother's arms into his new father's. Jed scooped him up, settling him on his hip. He looked at Elara, her face radiant in the golden light, and wrapped his free arm around her. The silence that fell was not empty or suffocating. It was a silence filled with peace, with contentment, with love. The echoes of a painful past had finally faded, replaced by the quiet, beautiful song of a new beginning. In the vast, untamed heart of the Wild West, a story isn't just about the clash of guns or the conquest of land. It's about the resilience of the human spirit. The story of Jedediah and Elara is a testament to that truth. It began with two broken souls, a man hollowed by grief and a woman haunted by her past, who came together not in a grand romance, but in a simple, desperate bargain for survival. They teach us that healing doesn't always come from a doctor's bag, but sometimes from a stranger's kindness, from the courage to stand against the darkness, and from the quiet strength it takes to plant a garden in barren soil. Their love story wasn't written in sonnets, but in shared struggle, in silent acts of care, and in the mutual decision to fight for a future that once seemed impossible. They discovered that a home is not a structure of wood and nails, but something you build in the heart of another. Here at Wild West Love Stories, we believe these are the tales that truly define the frontier. Stories of men who learn that true strength lies in vulnerability, and of women whose power is not in their beauty, but in their wisdom and their unyielding will to protect those they love. If their journey from the ashes of the past to a new dawn on the ridge has touched your heart, then you've found your home with us. Subscribe now, hit the like button, and share this story so you never miss another tale of the kind of love that leaves its own trail on the wild, beautiful landscape of the human heart.